Welcome to Broadband Breakfast Live Online, as well as your session at the Broadband Communities Summit. My name is Drew Clark. I'm the editor of Broadband Breakfast. I'm also the president of the Rural Telecommunications Congress, and I'm of counsel with ComLaw Group, a telecommunications firm in the Washington, D.C. area, and we work quite a bit in this area of broadband mapping and broadband compliance. We have a very good panel that will be participating in this Broadband Breakfast Live Online event. And of course, we're recording this, and this will be part of the Broadband Breakfast Virtual Summit taking place on on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, September 22nd, 23rd, and 24th. And this panel is, of course, the session on better broadband mapping for rural America. So if you're part of the Broadband Communities stream, welcome to this session. We have a great panel, which I'll introduce momentarily, and we're going to be talking about this issue of how broadband mapping has changed, is changing, and will continue to affect rural America and the issues associated with rural America. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panel of guests who are with us. And we have in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, Jack Lynch, who is the Director of State Engagements for the Education Superhighway. And in a moment, he'll tell us a little bit about Education Superhighway, how it's been involved in this broadband data space, and the role it plays. And then we also have Glenn Fishbein, who's not visible, but you'll be able to see a very exciting screen shortly. Glenn is the Chief Technology Officer of Geo Partners, LLC. And Glenn and I have had a number of interesting interactions over the past year as he's talked with me about his mapping tool and displayed it. I think actually Glenn was a prior guest on Broadband Breakfast Live Online, but during this session here for our Broadband Community Summit, he'll be speaking about a lot of aspects involving broadband mapping. So with that, I'm going to just say a few more words about the subject, and then we will turn first to Glenn and then to Jack to make presentations of about 10 minutes apiece. We're going to be going for 50 minutes from when we started so that we will fit right into the broadband community session that you are hopefully participating in as you watch here. And I wanted to say again a little bit about the issue of broadband mapping. And I'll do this by kind of going back in time. This has been quite a journey for the Federal Communications Commission and other government players. Our panel description says, much of the recent legislative focus on broadband mapping at the Federal Communications Commission and on Capitol has been driven by concerns from constituents in rural areas who are considered covered, when in fact they are living in a broadband desert. This session with Jack and Glenn and myself will consider some of these recent controversies in broadband mapping, including the FCC's digital opportunity data collection, and examine what particular communities are doing to map out broadband. So I want to just kind of highlight the uniqueness of our moment because, of course, of the COVID-19 pandemic. Broadband Communities is having this summit in an all virtual mode. And because of the pandemic, we at Broadband Breakfast launched a series of weekly events, Broadband Breakfast Live Online, bringing our community together in the virtual space. So because of that, we're kind of all adapting to new forms and new formats, and this being one of them. There's some of you who are live online, are regular watchers, and we're grateful to have you, and feel free to offer comments or questions in the stream, and we'll try to get to those. But others of you will be watching through the Broadband Communities Summit, and through that channel there'll be opportunity to chat and comment. So in some ways it'll be a commentary on the commentary we're having here. So we're all learning about these forms and formats, and it's because of broadband that we're able to do this, of course. Now, that being said, we're also learning from the COVID-19 pandemic just how inadequate broadband availability is in the United States. There are many, many gaps, many, many holes. And I want to just call your attention to some of the issues associated with the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. Now, at this time, September 2020, we're kind of in an intermediate stage, right? The applications have already needed to be submitted for the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, but the auction won't happen until October 29th. So it's kind of a bit of a quiet period. But we can talk about what RDOF is and is supposed to do. And what the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund is supposed to do is make more than $20 billion of federal funds available for rural broadband. And how is it deciding where funds are going? Through those broadband maps that the FCC has been collecting for 20 years. And quite frankly, the FCC acknowledged that it was using bad maps, flawed maps, as it doled out the first round of the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. This actually became a little bit of a political football at the agency because the Republicans said, we need to go ahead and do this, get RDOF funds out. The Democrats said, why are we doing this until we fix our maps? But the majority of Republicans prevailed. Of course, they have 3 votes instead of 2 votes. And they did so because they said they wanted to get funds out there in round 1 with the bad maps and improve them through what's called the Digital Opportunity Data Collection for round 2, which will be coming in another year or 2 years or something like that. So what is the Digital Opportunity Data Collection? Well, it's a new buzzword from the FCC that originated in August of last year. There's been recent action as soon as July, 2 months ago now, of 2020. And the Digital Opportunity Data Collection is a new system that will replace the long-standing Form 477. Okay, so the Form 477 is what the FCC began collecting in the year 2000. At that time, the definition of broadband was so slow, I believe it was just 200 kilobits in one direction. Now, of course, we have a definition of broadband as 25 megabits, and many people are critical that that's way too low, including myself. But that's going to a different topic. In this topic, the Form 477 start off collecting data at the zip code level, or I guess I should say the census tract level, which is roughly equivalent to zip codes. And then they've moved to the census block level over time. And now the current controversy or issue is, are we going to collect data at effectively the address level, the address of each home level? And it's not being called address level, it's being called a broadband fabric, because the notion is that even addresses can be deceptive because addresses specify a geographic point that may not be the place where broadband needs to be delivered. And so part of what the FCC is engaged in, their July 2020 report and order on the Digital Opportunity Data Collection, and further notice seeking comment about how this should be implemented, how it should, some of the specific technical details of this process. It's all underway. I guess that's the point that we're really getting to. DODC is crucial to things like the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, but it's crucial for much more than that. It's really crucial to be able to keep companies accountable, broadband companies accountable for what they're providing, where they're providing it. Also, the speeds that they're providing it at. I'd like it to be able to hold them accountable for pricing too, but pricing has not been a part of the FCC's data collection. But there's also crucial needs that I'm sure, or at least I hope we'll get to with Glenn and Jack, where we talk about ways that broadband data can be used to deploy broadband, and some of the mapping needs for fiber builds or wireless builds. Those are also another very important facet of broadband mapping. And since we're at a Broadband Communities event, or will be at a Broadband Communities event, I want to point everyone to an article that Broadband Communities published of mine in July, August of 2019 about broadband maps. We all agree they're flawed. How do we improve them? And in that article, I talk about some of these points. It's important to see broadband mapping is crucial, not just for the purpose of getting federal funds out, but also for many other stakeholders, from consumers to existing players to potential new entrants. Well, that is a kind of a summary. We're going to talk together, Glenn and Jack and I, after each of you have 10 minutes or so to lay out some of your thoughts on the subject. And again, since we are live through this format, I invite your comments through our comment stream or the Twitter hashtag Broadband Live. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Glenn. Glenn, I mentioned briefly your affiliation at Geo Partners, but could you be good enough to tell us a little bit about Geo Partners and what you are doing in the area of broadband data collection? And I've made your map full screen there so that everyone can see what you're displaying on your computer, Glenn. Go ahead.
Confirm, am I unmuted?
You are now unmuted.
Okay. All right. So Geo Partners is approximately 2.5 years old. We're a small Minnesota company. Otherwise known as feasibility studies for rural communities that are attempting to facilitate the expansion of broadband in their communities. And one of the first things that we started hitting was the FCC 477 data indicating that these communities were well served. And the impact of that was that made them ineligible for reconnect grants, for state grants, and other things like that. So what we decided we had to do is we had to give the communities the means by which they could come up with their own data sets, and they could thereby contest the FCC data as perhaps not the most accurate rendition of what was actually occurring in the community. So here we see an example of Washington State, which is currently doing a crowdsourced program utilizing our software under their umbrella. And this is the data collection of approximately somewhere around 25 to 30,000 data points of individuals who have been kind enough to go to their home PCs and execute speed tests. And then we've collected the data from that. So what you're seeing here in the color coding is black is no service. People can enter an address which has no service if they can find a place where there is service. Where we're seeing less than 10 meg down is red, less than 25 is yellow, more than 25 is green, and more than 500 is cyan. All right, so on the surface, this kind of looks like this is a big blob of different colors, but you can clearly see well-served areas and less well-served areas.
Glenn, can you just try to zoom in a little bit on your computer screen so people can get an even better view of that map?
Well, that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to look at a particular county called Stevens County, which is inside the state of Washington. And we'll get a much better sense for how this data lays out and how we can utilize it. All right, so this is Stevens County. And what we're looking at here, we're also showing existing fiber runs that are available for community development. We're also seeing CAF2 areas that are currently not eligible for funding from various sources for various reasons. And we start seeing a couple of things. We can start doing some toggles onto this thing. So we're basically going to drop in and out any services that are less than 20 megabits per second. So we start seeing areas that are essentially underserved. And then using a different toggle, we can take a look at what we classify as unserved, and our classification is no service or satellite only. So we start focusing on areas where there are services that aren't necessarily available. Now, one of the first things we start noticing is in areas where there is good service, such as Colville. In this community, there's a smack of unserved areas in a community that has superb charter communication services. So this leads to the first policy discussion that we weren't anticipating. Why do these people not have broadband service, even though the service is available? So that becomes policy issue number one. The economics of broadband are prohibiting many individuals in well-served communities to not have available services. The second thing that starts emerging as we start looking at these areas are cases where existing ISPs could expand into unserved areas at relatively low cost. So, for example, in this community called Kettle Falls, we see that there's a fair chunk of charter communication quality services that stops about right here on the Highway 25. And then as we move towards the west, we start seeing unserved areas that could be relatively inexpensively served. This is less than a kilometer from the charter drop points. There's about 400 households within this region here. Some of these are actually getting some of the charter, but a lot of this is cell phone coverage here, AT&T Mobility. And so we see charters running along this road, but there are areas down here where they could also expand into. So this allows a second local policy decision to be made, which is let's go talk to charter about expanding their services and try to demonstrate to them the economic viability of what they are doing. The third thing that comes about from this type of mapping is we start finding isolated pockets of no service. So for example, this area right here is a valley in the state of Washington that essentially has no service along this whole line here. So the question would be, can we do something for this, and what does the FCC data tell us about this area right here? So we can take a different view of this region and take a look at the FCC content versus the speed test content. And what we start seeing now is that, for example, the FCC data that I'm highlighting right here for a block group says that we've got 2 providers providing 100 megabits per second and 2 providing either 25 or 30 megabits per second. The speed test data shows that we've got 4 satellite providers, 5 no service providers, and 1 satellite provider. So this is a case whereby it is technically feasible to go to Reconnect or other grant sources and say, the FCC data says I've got service, but obviously I do not have service in this area. So this allows the communities to basically contest the 477 data and say, I do have a problem. I am worthy of a grant. Permit me to apply for this type of program. So this type of approach, the individual household, the individual crowdsourced mapping starts becoming very valuable and useful from the point of view of identifying individuals who do not have services and who do need services, and that even if the FCC data says they have services, you can start statistically demonstrating that they do not. So for example, when we talk about an area such as this, what we're trying to do is we're trying to come up with a statistically valid statement that the service is or is not available from a statistics point of view. So when we look at this particular block group, what we're looking at is the concept that we are going to determine how many samples are required to come up with a 95% confidence interval with various error intervals. So for example, in this block group, we need a total of 9 more samples in this area to claim this is statistically significant. Therefore, it is believable. So the approach that we're taking here is that when a community does contest the data, they will do it from a statistical point of view that has probability and a confidence interval, and that's going to be a very difficult argument to confront. So brief 10-minute summary, that's kind of how we're approaching this.
That is awesome. And again, let me just get our screens the way I want to. Glenn, could you talk a little bit more, just underline those 2 core points. When you said service is available, but service is not being taken, could you just maybe take another minute to like hammer that home? Why is that, right? What do you mean by that service is available, but it's not being taken?
All right, so let me go back and bring in Stevens County again here. Sometimes I get lost in my own mapping here. What we were looking at was the concept of originally when the FCC is saying service is available, they're talking about that in the area, if you want to, you can purchase a service that will give you broadband at a certain tier of support. So here what we're looking at, this is actually a data set that was extracted from the Colville School District of students who do not have access to broadband. The no service areas, almost all of them in this particular area, are students who do not have any broadband beyond the cell phone, if they have even that. So the concept here now is a policy issue of affordability. Previously, we had no way of talking about affordability. Now we can actually see the impact of affordability on broadband access. So these kids who have no service are sitting right next to people who've got superb quality services. That's a 31 megabit per second download capacity right down the block. And that kid has nothing. So this becomes a different issue in terms of broadband policy as to how do we bring services into areas which already have quality technology solutions, but may not have affordable solutions.
Excellent. Thank you for explaining that a little bit more. Now, to get granular and nerdy on us, the FCC is basically acknowledging, as I said, in the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, that it was excluding from the auction those blocks that some people are served. I guess we'd call them partially served, because they're partially served, and therefore they're counted as served under the old flawed methodology. And now, again, that's what the DODC, the Digital Opportunity Data Collection, is all about, making sure that those addresses that are not served within blocks that are partially served are included. Now, do you kind of parse that here in these dots you're showing us? Are you able to get at areas that are partially served? Let's call them. What's your take on that issue, Glenn?
All right. So again, these are two separate issues. The one I'm illustrating here is affordability. On a partial served issue, what we would see, for example, would be this may be a particular block group, and we may find a provider at the corner of a block group that is providing services. And then, let's see, this one, Desert Winds Wireless is sitting in here, and this is a particular block group region. So let's bring that into detail. And this will be a good example of a partial service area. So what we're seeing here is Desert Winds Wireless is sitting down here, and where are they? I'm a little bit lost here in my map. They've got good services. Let's see, is that it? Right there. In this particular block group, that's a 90 meg download capacity right there. But this entire extent of this block group, you've got a satellite and no services for the balance. So this block group extends down into here, and here you've got a quality service, and here you have no service. So this is a clear example of a partial block group that has some service, but the people who reside in the balance of the block group have nothing.
Excellent. Thank you for showing that to us. So let's broaden our lens, open up the topic, the discussion points a little bit more, and turn now to Jack Lynch of Education Superhighway. I was very excited to learn you'd be on this panel, because I've been kind of vaguely aware of and actually had some limited interactions with Education Superhighway, but you're doing some really awesome stuff. And I wondered if you could take a minute to tell us a little about the history of the organization and some of its current activities and portfolio, Jack, and maybe kind of how you view this issue of broadband mapping that Glenn has been talking about, and that we'll continue to talk about for the next, I guess, 27 minutes here, or so. So go ahead. The floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Drew. And yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. And I'm coming to everyone live from my in-laws' house right now in Southern California. And it turns out that they'd actually be one of those on Glenn's map, because I had no idea. I was very concerned about the internet access when we decided to come down here for the week, but it turns out that they've got residential fiber, and it's the best internet I've ever experienced. So there you go. But let me first talk a little bit about Education Superhighway and our experience that I think shows really the value of having good data and granular data, and how, if you have that data, you actually can close digital divides. So we're a nonprofit. We were founded in 2012, and our mission has been to get high-speed internet access to every single public K-12 school in the country. And when we first started our mission, you know, there wasn't great data on school connectivity. There was hardly any data. We mostly just had anecdotes, and I'll try to share my screen and see if I can show one of those anecdotes. So hopefully this is coming through. This is a letter. Can you see my screen right now?
We'll go ahead and add your screen. Oops, it just disappeared. I was about to add
try
it,
one
but
more
it
time.
disappeared. Try again. Yeah.
How about now?
Yes, there we go.
So this is the kind of thing we were hearing about in 2012, 2013. This is a letter from a grade school student in New Mexico to Sal Khan, who founded Khan Academy. And
can you go ahead and blow it up even bigger, Jack?
Yeah, absolutely. Is that still coming through?
Yeah, that's coming through good.
Great. And you may not be able to read all of the, I think it's third grade handwriting. But essentially, this is a young man named Andrew Delgado who wrote a letter to Sal Khan saying that he wanted to see if Sal Khan could come to his school in person to teach them, because they tried to access his videos, but the internet was too, in the words of Andrew Delgado, sucky for them to watch the Khan Academy videos online. So we were hearing stories like this in when we were first getting started, and we wanted to understand, okay, how big of a problem is this? How many schools are having this issue? But the data wasn't there. And so that was really our first goal at Education Superhighways. One of our first big goals was to try to address this data gap, because we didn't know how we were going to possibly bring equity to this issue and get all the schools high-speed internet access if we didn't have a good way to measure the current state of play. And in 2014, there was a big effort to modernize the Federal Communication Commission's E-rate program, which is the program that works to support connectivity for schools and libraries. And one of our big rallying cries, along with several other advocacy groups at that time, was we got to fix the data. We've got to get better data through the E-rate program. We've got to understand how much internet access all the schools currently have, what they're paying, who their providers are, and what type of infrastructure they have. Do they have fiber? Do they have DSL? Do they have a T1? Do they have dial-up? That was all going to be very important for us to actually address this problem. And we were very pleased that the FCC at the time agreed with us. And part of the E-rate modernization was a big push to make the data better, to include all of those things I just mentioned, and to also make it completely transparent, which it had not been before in the E-rate program. So after modernization, all this information was collected electronically, and anyone could go into the FCC's database and download the information. So that's exactly what we did. We took all of that data, we downloaded it and did some cleansing of it, because it, as those of us who have worked with government data know, it's not always the cleanest of data sets. So we put a little bit of work into it. We put a front end on it so that it was easily searchable and navigable for anyone in the education community or in the broadband community that wanted to see it. And what we ended up with is a portal that was more or less a pricing transparency portal. And I'm going to share my screen again to show an example of this. Hopefully this is going to work as well. Is that active now, Drew?
This is Glenn. I don't see it, and I think Drew just dropped.
Oh, well, hopefully Drew will come back on, and I don't know if we're still recording, but I'll just keep talking. And what was that, Glenn?
It's recording.
Okay, great. We'll keep going then. It's possible that Drew is not so fortunate as me right now and doesn't have residential fiber. But anyways, what I'm going to show is what we did with all of that E-rate data once it became public. We put it on a map, much like the map, Glenn, that you were showing earlier, except this was, at least for schools, for K-12 school buildings, granular to the address level, to the location level, and we knew actually what service was being received for every single K-12 public school in the country, essentially. By doing that, we were able to very, with a razor sharp focus, identify specifically which schools were not meeting the FCC standard for digital learning in schools, for the bandwidth required for that. And we were able to really systematically go through, work with states, work with local education agencies, and work with service providers to improve the access that schools were receiving. And Drew, I see that you're back. I'm not sure if you're able to allow my screen to come through again, but I was just
Let's add
talking
your screen.
to.
There we go.
Yeah, so this is what we were able to do once the FCC updated the E-rate program and the data that was being collected as part of the E-rate program. And as you can see, Drew, they even made your wish come true as far as E-rate's concerned and showed the pricing as well. So we can see for every single school district, I'm showing Kansas as an example, that's actually my home state, where, for any particular school district, what's their cost, how much bandwidth are they getting, who's their service provider, how many students are they serving. We could show nearby deals to those school districts to see what their neighboring school districts were paying and if it was better or worse. And not only that, but as I was just saying, working with local education groups, working with state government to actually direct resources and really target those resources to the schools that weren't at the standard, the schools that didn't have a scalable connection. Maybe they weren't on fiber and we wanted to help them upgrade. This data was essential in driving that progress. And here's a look at our national report from last year. And this data is even essentially a year old at this point. But when Education Superhighway started, only about 25% of the school districts in the country were meeting the FCC's standard for the bandwidth that was required for basic digital learning. And as of last year, now 99% of school districts are meeting that standard. And you can see, how the number of students that were in schools that were meeting the standard has grown over the last 5 years, essentially. And also, importantly, how the price was able to drop. And this was a big key to all this, as schools were able to leverage not only data to understand their level of connectivity, but what a good deal was and what, how they could kind of use competition and pricing transparency to harness better and better prices from service providers. The cost of broadband for schools has gone down dramatically. So that's what we've been up to at Education Superhighway. And I think the last point I'll make that sort of ties into all of this, and it also touches on a piece that Glenn was touching on a moment ago. What happened last spring when coronavirus happened, and all of a sudden it didn't actually matter so much, at least for the time being, that all the schools had really good internet access. We needed to make sure that students at their homes had really good internet access. And so Education Superhighway last spring pivoted a little bit. We'd never focused on home connectivity before, but we wanted to help out. We didn't want to sit on the sidelines while so many schools and so many students were struggling without internet access at home. And so we started looking at this issue, and we came up with an estimate that there were about 9.5 million students across the country that didn't have good internet access at home. There's been other groups that have come up with their own studies that put this number as high as maybe 15 or 16 million. The point there is they're all estimates. We don't actually know how many people don't have internet access at home, and we don't know specifically who those students are in most cases. School districts were not collecting this information, and the FCC's maps aren't granular enough to really tell you which homes do and don't have internet access. And not only do they have the ability, do they have the access, but also are they able to afford it? Are they subscribing? So that's really what we've been focusing on with this home connectivity gap for students that has really become front and center over the last 6 months. And this map's going to look a lot like Glenn's maps. We're trying to do this for schools.
Go ahead and expand this window there, if you don't mind, Jack.
So this is dummy data. What we've learned as we've gotten into the student home connectivity space is that there's a lot of data sensitivity and student privacy concerns. So I'm not showing real data right now. This is our fake demo district called Hogwarts.
From Britain, yeah, exactly.
That's right. But what the goal here is that each of these dots should represent a home or an address of a student that's not connected. And what we'd like to be able to do is overlay which service providers can serve them. And so again, this should look very similar to the maps that Glenn was showing. And right now we're relying on the 477 data from the FCC to do this, but we know that's not good enough. We can't actually be sure that a certain service provider is able to provide service at these locations just based on the 477 data. So that's a gap right now, and it's something that's going to be critical for so many different broadband equity issues, not the least of which is student connectivity at home. So I'll pause there and hand it back over to you, Drew.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And we've got 15 minutes to continue our discussion here. Let me ask you, Jack, kind of a follow-up question here. And I apologize for being off and on. Sometimes that's what happens with broadband, right? But tell me what your observation of the digital opportunity data collection process has been from kind of its rollout as a concept, or at least as a bureaucratic concept last August 2019 to the further notice that came out 2 months ago. What are the views that Education Superhighway has about what needs to happen to improve specific broadband mapping in this arena, Jack?
Yeah, so I think we would say that, we agree with the goals of these efforts. We agree that we need to get to a place where we have fabric level information. We have address level data on which homes in America can be served, either can or can't be served currently, and which ones we would take it maybe a small step further and say which ones actually are receiving service, which I know Glenn was also touching on as well. There's a lot of work left to do, though. It's unclear to what extent the service provider community is going to be willing to share, be open and forthcoming with, I think, the data that they have. But we think they're a critical player. They've shown a lot of willingness to share data with schools now, given what's been happening in the last 6 months, and really be more forthcoming about helping the community to understand who can and can't be served. We've got to do that for more than just schools, though, right? If we actually want to close the digital divide in America, we've got to have everyone really committed to this goals of open and transparent data. And you commented earlier, Drew, on the effort to move forwards with the RDOF funding, before we're done with the mapping. And I think that's a concern for us, right? Especially when you're thinking about the scale of how much money's being doled out, right? $20 billion.
16.4 in the first round, and they're holding on to another $4 billion for the next round, plus whatever's not doled out this round. So just to be clear, that's the segment between the round with the bad data and the next round that would hopefully be based on good data.
So thanks for that clarification. And obviously, I think everyone would agree, and the Democrats and Republicans do agree, that ideally we'd like to be able to have really good data to spend that kind of money, right? And so it's concerning that that we're sort of shooting from the hip with so much of this funding, but we've all got to work together to get to a place where good data can guide those decisions.
Well, and let me make two additional points, Jack and Glenn, and I want to bring Glenn into this piece of the discussion. The first of these is that the FCC has been hammered for years over broadband data, and we could go back, and maybe we will, to kind of take the long view. First, this was NTIA and FCC's responsibility, and then it became FCC's responsibility, and so a lot was lost in that transition of information and institutional knowledge and so forth. And former hat, I was the executive director of Broadband Illinois, the Partnership for a Connected Illinois, which was the state broadband initiative entity for one of 56 states and territories, and we definitely had a role beyond collecting data and mapping it, in which we worked with local providers on helping them to use and to figure out how to access markets and to train people to use broadband. These were all part and parcel of that project and that program. But one part was collecting data and shipping the data to NTIA and the FCC. Once that ended about 5 years ago, the FCC's kind of been on its own, and the data has gotten stale. All that old data has gotten stale, and so the maps have gotten worse and worse and worse, and they've been hammered by it. I mean, you have late night comedians who make fun of the FCC's broadband maps, right? That's how bad it's gotten. And so Congress got into this game too. And earlier this year, they passed the Broadband Data Act, right? Which is an acronym for something beyond that, but really does deal with broadband data. And it basically said, FCC, do what you're doing, but do it right, and it made some refinements and some changes to what the FCC was on track to do, and that's kind of had forced the FCC to redirect a little bit. And so, their notice 2 months ago was saying, their report and order 2 months ago was basically saying, okay, we recognize Congress has now passed this law, basically saying we need to keep doing this. But the other piece of it is that Congress has not appropriated funds for the FCC to take the next step. And that's the other piece that the FCC kind of keeps highlighting, that, hey, we know we're supposed to do this, but we haven't been funded to do this. So anyway, those are two additional points I wanted to make there before we kind of open it up to all of us. And Glenn, what are some of your thoughts on the work that Jack and Education Superhighway has been involved in? It is interesting to see, as Jack highlighted, how very important the address level or fabric level data has become. What are your thoughts on what Jack has said and some of these points we've been discussing, Glenn?
Well, I think the COVID issue is the one that's really kicked everybody in the chin. I don't know how many students are without broadband service. I know that we measure that routinely. We got emergency requests for services for instant student networks that have to be done tomorrow, which can't be done. But what we're also seeing is a large community support effort. For example, the state of Washington made all state facilities that had broadband access hotspot points, specifically for kids. There's a consortium of 50 to 100 companies, I don't know the current count, led by Land O'Lakes, a commercial enterprise in rural America, where they're trying to get every one of their facilities to have a public hotspot throughout rural America. They've done a number of their facilities. We were just told that there's a particular ag firm in Kentucky that's putting up 200 of their facilities to provide hotspots for kids. I mean, because of the speed at which this came upon us, there's not what I would call a lot of logic and engineering behind these types of approaches, but it's mobilized a lot of private sector companies to support this effort in general, far beyond the scope of what government has been able to do. So from Jack's point of view, you've got a lot of support that is not coming from the governments, but rather from the locals who are invested in their own communities.
So, Jack, and forgive me if you touched on this that moment I left and jumped back in, but I understand from some press reports that you've actually been involved in some Wi-Fi hotspots of your own. Is that incorrect, or could you just comment on the role that Education Superhighway has played in that regard in San Francisco, perhaps, or elsewhere?
Yeah, I'd be happy to touch on that. So when COVID hit in the spring and schools were left scrambling, quite frankly, because they'd never really considered it their responsibility for the most part to ensure that their students had internet access at home. COVID changed all that. It changed that mindset. And in some ways, that change in mindset creates an opportunity for us to make progress on the issue of connecting homes that we've never made before, because now there's this new entity, these new groups that now are saying it's our responsibility to make sure people have access if that's the way that we're delivering education. But what we were doing with these hotspots, or we call them super spots, was people were looking for fast solutions. It was basically, we called them super spots. That's not an official term. That's just our term. But or super hotspots, right? These are essentially what we were using is the same technology that you may have heard of that sometimes people have mounted on school buses to provide mobile internet. It's a large, relatively large, about the size of a briefcase. A small briefcase is the size of the equipment itself, but it's a piece of equipment that takes an LTE signal and then turns it into a Wi-Fi signal, just like any other hotspot would. But it's much more powerful than like a personal hotspot, and it has a bit better range and can bond multiple LTE signals together to create better bandwidth. So we were taking these devices and we were experimenting with them because, like Glenn said, we didn't have time to prepare for this. Really, it was school was going about business as usual, or school as usual, on one week, and then the next week they were scrambling and looking for quick solutions. So our idea was that there might be a way to use these devices to bring connectivity to places that were struggling, potentially to low-income housing areas, to maybe community centers that didn't have internet access already that they could turn on, but people could maybe congregate safely at to get a connection. So we partnered with San Francisco Unified School District and a couple of other school districts in the Bay Area where our headquarters is to basically try to deploy 50 of these devices. And really, we were trying to learn. We were trying to learn if they could be useful and in addressing this problem. And the results, quite frankly, were mixed. One piece I'll highlight because it's pertinent to this conversation is, LTE signals aren't the same everywhere. Even in urban areas, on one block, you might get a very strong signal from AT&T, and on the next block, AT&T doesn't have good service through their LTE network, and it's actually Verizon that has better service. And then the next block over, maybe none of the major carriers have good service. And there's also 477 data on mobile coverage that it is just as unreliable as the wired coverage. So that was a big struggle, was understanding which carrier do we need to use based on where we want to deploy these devices. So it gets back to mapping, but in a nutshell, that's the effort that we undertook.
Okay, let me ask each of you, and I'll start with you, Glenn, and then you, Jack. Could you just kind of hazard a guess as to how this digital opportunity data collection ends? I mean, what's the way forward, both ideally what you'd like to see and realistically what you think will happen, Glenn, and as the FCC works through this process of getting better data collection?
I think the fundamental problem with the RDOF designations of eligible and ineligible groups suffers from essentially the same problem the FCC has had with 477 data in the past. It relies on accurate reporting from vendors who are working from a profit motive. And the net on that is that you will find some companies, and I'll praise this one, Charter Communications, provide some of the best data of all the ISPs out there. And then there's a slug of others that I won't mention that provide crap. And you can't tell them apart unless you're actually looking at the data at the level at which we're looking at it. When we looked at the RDOF mapping, we saw essentially the same thing. You have areas that are RDOF eligible, which should be, and you've got areas that are not RDOF eligible that also should be. And as long as you are relying upon a vendor with a profit motive to be your primary provider of data sources, you're guaranteed that there will be inaccuracies. Now, the counter to that, there are two parts to the counter. One is going to the citizen, which is what we're trying to do, to get the citizen report on what is happening at their home, at their business. The second thing is to get the allocation of money to not be done at the federal level, but to get it done at the block grant level. Allow the states, those states that are capable of doing it, and there are many, to receive a proportion of the dollars and then distribute it to the areas that they know. State agencies that work on their own broadband projects know where the problems are. They know where the money should be spent. They know which ISPs are reputable and which are not. And that's something the feds are never going to be very good at. So the second part, shift to a block grant funding strategy rather than this blanket activity that the reverse auctions are doing today.
Literally a block grant, a census block grant. No, just kidding.
No, it could be literally a block grant to the census block group, but opportunity districts are not defined that way, but they still are functionally fundable.
Very good. Jack, last words that you have in responding to this question.
Yeah, I agree with everything Glenn just said, and I guess what I'll add is I think how is this going to play out? Well, you mentioned, Drew, some of the funding issues at the federal level. Some states have gone ahead and charged forwards without the federal government on the mapping issue. Right. The state of Georgia is one that comes to mind, a good example of getting to that fabric level data kind of on their own. I think you're going to see more states do that because this data is just so important. So we'll probably see that happening over the next few years as the federal government sort of plays catch up and sorts things out. And then I'll double down on one of Glenn's points. We can't just be relying solely on vendor provided data. We've got to figure out a way to bring in, a lot of different data sources, citizen reported data, as Glenn said, and just figure out how to make that really efficient so that we can have a much higher level of confidence in the data that exists.
Well, my own 2 cents on the topic is that we definitely need to make sure to make as much data as possible open and transparent, so that there can be kind of comparisons. There can be different levels of data, have levels of accuracy or reliability percentages, if you will, on data. We're entering a period where there's a renewed appreciation for the vitality, the vitalness of getting broadband data at the address level, the fabric level. What we need to do now is to make sure that we're not relying on data from any one particular source, but comparing multiple sources too. So with that, I want to just thank Glenn and Jack for being with us, for your time and effort, and for each of you, whether you're joining for Broadband Breakfast Live Online every Wednesday at 12 noon, or whether you're at the Broadband Communities Summit. Thank you for participating, and feel free to join future events. I'm Drew Clark of Broadband Breakfast. I'll see you next week or at the next session. Take care.